in the heart of West Africa, a storm of history was unleashed, not with a gun, not with a scandal, but with a promise $1.2 billion, drawn from the veins of gold that for decades slipped away into foreign hands, was turned into life itself. For generations, families stood at the gates of hospitals, mothers clutching sick children, fathers selling the last piece of land, elders whispering prayers because they could not pay. Too many died before the doors opened. Too many graves were dug for lack of coins. But then came a young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, barely 40 years old. Stepping to the microphone in the capital of Ouagadugu, his words shook the continent more than cannons. No citizen of Burkina Faso shall die because they could not afford medical care. It was not a slogan. It was a line carved into history, a vow against centuries of neglect. What does it mean for a nation once dismissed as poor to say that life will no longer be sold? Could this be the dawn of a new sovereignty not written in debt, but in dignity? Stay with us because this isn't just another story, it's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and walk with us for an Africa that never bows again. There are wounds that cannot be seen with the naked eye, but they bleed across generations. For Africa, one of those wounds was carved in the 1992nd when international lenders, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank imposed what they called structural adjustment. To the world, it sounded technical, like reform, like progress. But to the poor at the gates of hospitals, it was a death sentence written in contracts they never signed. They told our governments, make the people pay for their medicine, introduce user fees. Cost sharing will increase efficiency. That word was repeated in boardrooms from Washington to Geneva, but what did efficiency look like in Burkina Faso? It looked like a mother pawning her wedding ring to buy antibiotics. It looked like a child gasping for air while his father searched for coins to pay for oxygen. It looked like graves dug, not because the medicine did not exist, but because it was priced beyond reach. In 1989, a man named Yakuba buried his brother because there was no money for an infection. He was just one among thousands. Across Burkina Faso, children died of malaria while clinics demanded fees before treatment. Women gave birth on dirt floors because maternity wards asked for deposits they did not have. Hospitals became markets where survival was bought and sold like any other commodity. The truth was, this Africa did not lack doctors or nurses, or even medicine. What it lacked was justice. The gold under its soil, the cotton from its fields, the uranium from its mines, all of it flowed outward, and in return, the people were told to pay for bandages, to pay for blood tests, to pay for life itself. The logic of the lenders was brutal in its simplicity. If you cannot pay, you do not deserve to live. This legacy stretched into the 21st century, while skyscrapers rose in foreign capitals financed by African wealth. Villages in Burkina Faso buried their children for lack of pennies. Entire communities came to fear hospitals, not because of disease, but because of debt. Parents whispered to their children, better to stay home and pray than to enter those gates and come out with nothing but bills. And yet, amid this darkness, the ancestors whispered. They had survived slave ships, plantations, colonial wars. They had endured centuries when the value of black life was measured only in labor and taxes. Their message was clear: do not forget, do not bow. But for too long, leaders bowed. They bowed in Paris. They bowed in Washington. They bowed in silence while their people died outside the very institutions meant to heal them. It is in this wound, this deep, festering injustice, that the announcement of Captain Ibrahim Traoré struck like lightning. For when he said, "No citizen shall die because they could not afford medical care," he was not simply launching a new policy. He was answering the cries of 30 years. He was speaking into graves that never should have been dug. He was restoring dignity to elders who had learned to fear the sound of hospital doors. The wound is not forgotten. It is written in memories of mothers who sold goats for medicine. It is written in the silence of fathers who could not save their sons. It is written in every village where the word hospital once meant debt, but history turned, and the wound, though deep, began to be healed not by charity, not by loans, but by justice. For the first time in a generation, Burkina Faso dared to say life will no longer be priced, health will no longer be sold. In Ouagadougou, under the harsh white lights of the presidential press hall, silence hung heavier than smoke. The crowd was restless. Journalists adjusted their cameras. Ministers whispered behind folders. They expected the usual speech, a plea for loans, a request for aid, a performance for donors. But instead, the youngest leader in Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, walked in without ceremony. No polished suit, no golden epaulettes, only fatigues and boots caked in red Sahel dust. He did not need grandeur. His presence was enough. His eyes did not search for approval. They looked through the cameras, through the walls, into the soul of a people who had waited too long. On the desk before him lay a single folder stamped with the national seal of Burkina Faso. Inside was a figure written in bold black ink, 1.2 billion United States dollars. When he spoke, the words were not delivered as an option. They were thunder. From this day forward, no citizen of Burkina Faso shall die because they could not afford medical care. The room froze. Some gasped. Some blinked in disbelief. But the captain's voice did not tremble. It was the voice of one who had walked battlefields, buried comrades, and seen mothers cry over coffins. For decades, presidents had promised reforms but signed away mines. They had shaken hands in Paris while their people starved in Ouagadougou. They had nodded to contracts that granted corporations 3% of the nation's gold, while hospitals charged families for painkillers. But President Ibrahim Traoré was cut from another cloth, a cloth woven with defiance, stitched with the memory of Thomas Sankara, and dyed in the blood of fallen soldiers. Months earlier, in a private cabinet session, he had already shocked his ministers. 70% of our gold will return to our people, he said with calm fire. Let the corporations keep 30% so they can witness what sovereignty looks like. His words were not negotiable. They were a decree. Contracts that once bled the nation were canceled legally, unapologetically. For the first time in living memory, convoys of trucks rolled not out of the country but into it. Women in Kaya stood by the roadside with tears in their eyes. That is our gold coming home, one whispered. At the National Reserve Depot, soldiers and engineers unloaded bar after bar of bullion. 3 tons in 4 days, muttered Amadou, the logistics chief. Before we counted scraps, now we count truth in solid form. Each bar was weighed, stamped, and registered not to vanish into offshore accounts but to serve the living. From this treasure was born the People's Health Fund. No Swiss trustees, no Dubai accounts, no Paris foundations, only a vow gold turned into anesthesia, bullion into birth, ore into medicine. It was not charity. It was justice crystallized. And when the captain addressed the nation on radio and television, his words echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. This money is not hidden abroad. It is in your hospitals, in your medicine, in your survival. This was the moment when a soldier became more than a head of state. He became a guardian. He was not begging for help. He was not negotiating for dignity. He was declaring that dignity was already theirs. For too long, leaders had acted like middlemen between their people and foreign banks. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré broke that chain. He stood, unarmed except with truth, and placed his people before profit. It is easy to make speeches. It is harder to build systems. But in that moment, in that hall, in that voice, something in Africa stirred. From Mali to Guinea, from Detroit to Dakar, people whispered the same thought. Perhaps this is what leadership should feel like: protective, principled, powerful. And so, One man stood up, and by standing, lifted a nation with him. It is one thing to speak from a podium, it is another to turn words into life. After the gold was secured, after the decree was signed, came the hardest test delivery. Could a nation often described as poor transform bullion into breath, into bandages, into birth? Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not hesitate. He understood that bureaucracy was often another form of denial. Too many promises had died inside folders. Too many lives lost to paperwork. What good is a pledge if it collapses under its own weight? He asked his ministers. Do not build a system that screens people out. Build one that welcomes them in. Thus was born the National Health Access Card. Small, blue, durable, but carrying the weight of a nation's dignity. It was embedded with biometric data, linked to a national database, and distributed to millions in record time. 4 categories were enrolled automatically: households below the poverty line, children under 16, elders above 65, and pregnant women. Within 6 weeks, more than 8 million citizens held the card in their hands. The rollout was breathtaking. Teams on motorbikes and pickup trucks traveled dusty trails to remote villages. Old women wept when their names lit up on scanners. I thought it was a joke, said Aka, a grandmother from Seguen, until they scanned my name and the nurse said, "You are covered." I cried. Doctors who had long turned patients away now opened their doors. If you have the card, you walk through, explained Dr. Isa Nepon at Yalgado Ouedraogo University Hospital. We don't ask if you can pay, we ask what you need. And the system worked. In the first month alone, over 112,000 patients received treatment without paying a single franc. Surgeries were performed, prescriptions filled. Ambulance dispatched. For the first time, hospitals recorded full bed usage, not from overcrowding, but because people no longer postponed illness for fear of debt. Critics waited for chaos. They predicted fraud, corruption, shortages, but the system was armored with transparency. Each card was geo-tracked, matched against hospital entry logs. Monthly audits were made public, not as propaganda, but as principle. And instead of collapse, the opposite occurred. Public trust surged. Families began to believe, again, not in politics, but in protection. The impact was immediate. A boy once denied a scan received it free and lived. A mother in Kaya gave birth without fear of eviction from her home. In Gawa, Dr. Pauline Dio saved the life of a 10-year-old with a simple procedure his family could never have afforded. She whispered afterward, "Why did he have to wait until now?" The transformation rippled beyond medicine. Volunteerism among young medical students rose by 60%. Rural clinics saw a surge in job applications. For the first time, foreign doctors from Senegal and Chad requested visits to study the model. UNICEF reported a 10% drop in child mortality in zones covered by the initiative, all within 5 months. But implementation was not without resistance. International observers muttered about sustainability. Boardrooms in Washington shifted uneasily. Old contracts had been torn, old profits disrupted. Yet the people of Burkina Faso did not care for financial lectures. They cared for the breath in their children's lungs, the beating hearts saved in surgery rooms, the quiet dignity of walking into a hospital without shame. This was not just policy. It was rebellion against a system that monetized healing. It was the most radical form of sovereignty, turning natural wealth into human survival. No forms, no deposits, no delays, only dignity. As patients lined up not for paperwork but for care, as children walked out of clinics alive, the world could no longer dismiss it as rhetoric. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had made his declaration real. The promise did not crumble. It stood. As firm as the gold that funded it, change is never measured only in statistics. It is measured in the way a mother breathes easier when she hears her child will be treated. It is measured in the tears of an old man who never thought he would live to see a doctor. In villages across Burkina Faso, the policy was not an abstract decree. It was flesh, blood, survival. In the white-walled surgical unit of Kaya, a 6-year-old girl survived a congenital heart defect last year. The cost was 5 million CFA, an impossible sum. This year, her mother lifted a small blue health card and whispered, "The real miracle is not her survival, it is not being asked for money." In Gova, two sisters played on a hospital bed, giggling with a shared toy. Their mother, Salamata, once feared eviction from her home more than her children's fever. Now she said simply, "Captain Traoré saved my family, not just with medicine, but with time." These were not isolated moments. By the third month, over 200,000 surgeries had been performed without out-of-pocket costs. Rural maternity visits increased by 70%. Families began to see hospitals not as markets but as sanctuaries. One nurse painted it plainly on a clinic wall: "We are no longer afraid of illness. We are no longer afraid of each other." The transformation was cultural. Churches rang bells in thanksgiving. Mosques held prayer sessions for a president who, as they said, no longer kneels abroad to heal at home. At the University of Ouagadugu, a philosophy student stood before his peers and asked, "Is this our version of Sankara's defiance? Scalpels instead of slogans, hospitals instead of parades." The name Thomas Sankara returned to the nation's lips not as nostalgia, but as continuity. Ibrahim Traoré was no copy, but he was a son of that same spirit. Beyond borders, the shock waves spread. Mali's health minister requested a copy of the decree. Guinea began reviewing mining contracts. In Senegal, student unions demanded a debate to abolish hospital fees. Africa News carried headlines that stirred the diaspora. Burkina Faso redefines healthcare, a model for sovereignty. Meanwhile, in the diaspora, elders in Detroit, Atlanta, Kingston, and Lagos watched broadcasts with trembling hands. One man in Detroit whispered to his empty room, "I buried my brother because we could not afford a doctor. Now look at them over there. Look what they are doing." For African Americans over 60 who had carried decades of injustice, the policy was not distant news. It was a mirror, a reminder of what dignity looks like when defended. This was more than free medicine. It was a declaration of African sovereignty. It told the world that gold was no longer just for vaults in Paris, no longer just for shareholders in London. It was for heart surgeries in Ouagadugu, for vaccinations in Dedugu, for the breath of children in Dori. Skeptics asked if it could last, but the more pressing question was different. What if it spread? What if health could no longer be commodified? What if Pan-Africanism was not just a slogan of unity but a practice of justice? The answer was already echoing in murals, prayers, and classrooms. A nation once dismissed as fragile had built a system more daring than most of the developed world, and in doing so, it had left behind not only healthier bodies but a living legacy, proof that sovereignty is not theory, it is survival. Sometimes revolutions do not roar with gunfire. They whisper in hospital corridors, in the steady hum of new machines, in the laughter of children who would not have lived a year ago. Across Burkina Faso, something deeper than medicine was being restored: trust. In Ouagadougou, a mural stretched across an old colonial building. A nurse lifted a newborn in one arm, the people's health card in the other. Insevs, beneath it, painted in plain white letters, were the words, "We are no longer afraid of illness. We are no longer afraid of each other." That was not propaganda. It was testimony. At provincial hospitals, patients lined up not to pay but to shake hands. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré visited unannounced, dressed in dusty boots, people reached for him not as a distant ruler but as a man who listened. A woman holding a newborn whispered, "They told me it's all free." He nodded gently, "Yes. Because your child is part of this country, here. Health is not a privilege, it is your right, Nurses wept. Doctors stood taller. The air itself felt lighter. This was not charity. This was not a gift. This was sovereignty written into flesh. And it awakened something long dormant. Young graduates returned to medicine not out of obligation but pride. Communities volunteered, transporting the sick, building clinics, spreading awareness. A country once described as dependent was suddenly teaching the world what independence could mean, but the resonance did not stop at its borders. In Mali, Guinea, Senegal, even as far as Jamaica and Detroit, people spoke the same question. If they can do this, why not us? Africa News ran stories of students debating health sovereignty. In Accra, a youth forum coined a phrase, from gold to life, the Burkina model, and the diaspora felt it too. In Harlem church basements, elders whispered prayers of thanks. In Detroit, a retired steelworker murmured, I buried my brother for lack of a doctor. Now look, Africa is teaching the world again. For African Americans over 60, who carried the memory of civil rights marches, segregation, and injustice. This was not just foreign news, it was prophecy fulfilled. For the first time in decades, Pan-Africanism was not a word in books but a policy in action, not just speeches, but surgeries, not just rallies, but prescriptions, the spirit of Sankara, the courage of Nkrumah, the defiance of Lumumba all seemed to echo in Captain Ibrahim's voice. He was not claiming perfection, he was proving possibility, and so a new faith spread, quieter than slogans but stronger than chains. It was the faith that a continent long dismissed as poor could be rich in dignity. That sovereignty was not about flags and borders, but about whether a mother could walk into a clinic without fear. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, the people began to say amen, and they did in villages, in cities. In diaspora living rooms, lit by television screens, a chorus rose across languages and oceans. The question now was no longer whether Burkina Faso could sustain it. The question was whether the world could ignore it. A nation is not remembered by the speeches its leaders give, but by the lives they protect. In Burkina Faso, gold was once a curse mined, exported, enriching others while the people buried their children for lack of medicine. But under President Ibrahim Traoré, gold was transformed into breath, into healing, into survival. This was more than policy. It was defiance. It was a declaration of African sovereignty, a refusal to let foreign banks dictate who deserves to live, and it was continuity. For decades, Thomas Sankara preached self-reliance. Today, Ibrahim Traoré carries that torch, proving that Sankara's dream was not buried, it was planted. Across the continent, whispers of change stir. Mali, Guinea, Senegal, even far across the Atlantic. In Detroit and Kingston, people are asking, if they can do this, why not us? This is Pan-Africanism, not as theory, but as daily bread, as surgery, as medicine freely given. This is sovereignty written into hospitals, not just into constitutions. The world may debate sustainability. Economists may quibble over figures, but in the maternity wards of Ouagadugu, in the dusty clinics of Dori, in the voices of nurses who now treat without asking for coins, the truth is undeniable dignity has returned. So let us ask ourselves, when the dust settles, what will we remember? Will we recall the fear of scarcity or the joy of sufficiency? Will our children inherit leaders who bow, or leaders who build? Would our ancestors be proud of what we dared to do with their prayers? If you believe in this vision, let it not stop here. Speak it, share it, write it on the walls of memory and the hearts of generations. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Burkina Faso, latest news. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso Ibrahim Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré Sankara. Ibrahim Traoré speech. Pan-Africanism. Africa news. Burkina Focus. President Ibrahim Traoré. New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it.